Shalom and welcome to Rodeph Emet, Pursuer of Truth. This is Bracha about Yosef, and we are here today discussing the roots of anti-Semitism. And we have with us again Mr. Joseph Atwill, who wrote a book called Caesar's Messiah, which deals with the Roman origin of Christianity. And I'm glad to have Mr. Atwill back. Thank you for being here again.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And for those of the viewers who've missed out the first couple of episodes of this, I'd like you to briefly go into the background of your book, Caesar's Messiah. What is the main thesis of your book?
I'm happy to do that. The main thesis is simply that the Gospels were created by a group of Roman Caesars, the Flavians, and that the character Jesus essentially is a mythologic character, like Hercules. The Gospels were created because the Flavians had been engaged in a 100-year, well, the entire war took 100 years, struggle with a messianic movement of Jews in Israel. And they decided to create an alternative religion that would be a pacifistic version of Judaism that would cooperate with the Roman Empire. So that is the basic thesis of the book, is that the Gospels were produced by Rome and were done so as a kind of military, psychological operation. That's the primary thesis. But perhaps a more interesting aspect of the book is that the Gospels themselves are not simply the story of a pacifistic Messiah, but in fact are directly linked to Titus Flavius's military campaign. In other words, all of the events of Jesus' ministry are based upon the events of Titus's campaign. And were in fact a kind of prophecy of that campaign.
I see. Okay. Well, can you give us a little more background on the war between the Romans and the Jews?
Sure. The war began because the Jews refused to worship Caesar. Throughout the Roman Empire, every imaginable kind of religion was permitted. The only exception to that was you had to permit the worship of Caesar in the temples. The Jews, because of their monotheistic background, just couldn't abide with this and kicked the images of Caesar out of their temple. And then this led to Nero inviting or ordering Vespasian into Judea and to subdue the messianic movement. So the first point that someone really has to recognize, and it's strangely not well understood by the general populace, is that there was a messianic movement in Palestine at the time that Christianity is supposedly emerging, which is completely militaristic. It was the basis of the rebellion against the Roman Empire. And this point is critical in understanding the era and understanding the religious context that Christianity, comes from, because the people in this movement were Christians in the sense that they followed a Christ. The word Christ simply means Messiah. So that for one thing, when you discuss Christians being, taken to Rome and killed in the Colosseum, when people criticize my theory, one of the things that they often bring up is that, look, the Romans were attacking the Christians. They were, killing the Christians. How could they possibly be promoting Christianity? And the reason they even ask the question is because they are sort of unfamiliar with the history, that there was a movement of Christians that was militaristic, that the historians of the era record as having been captured, being brought to Rome, and actually killed in the Colosseum. So that's the real Christian-Roman relationship. is one of a military movement and an occupying army.
So you're saying that the Christians who were persecuted were the messianic Jewish movement?
Exactly, and you see, even you can see in your question that it's difficult even to talk about it because of the semantical problem of what the word Christian means. But that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that the one of the elements of the creation of Christianity, that the Roman Jews, was to essentially steal the history of the real messianic movement. In my book, I show that, for example, the apostle Simon or Peter, his history being taken, to Rome and being executed, is actually stolen in the Christian Gospels. They take that character and make him an apostle of the Christ. And at the end of the Gospels, Jesus predicts that Simon is going to be taken to Rome and given a death to glorify God. And this is literally true, but the individual that he's speaking to is not, at that particular moment anyway, a Roman Christian, but he's one of the Jewish Christians who is in fact fighting against Rome. The Gospels are very delicate literature, very, very finely tuned literature. One of the purposes is to try to absorb the history of the real messianic movement and make it the history of Christianity that is being controlled by Rome, so that it makes more believable in terms of its historical basis.
Okay, so who were the apostles?
These are images, literary images of the Maccabees. If you look at the names of the apostles, you'll see the names of the Maccabees pop up. You have Simon, John, Judas, Matthew. And what the Gospels are doing is they're trying to show that this history of the Maccabees, who were essentially the family that was leading the struggle against Rome, became these docile, pacifistic followers of the Prince of Peace. The purpose of the Gospels is, on one level, is to simply try to pacify the Messianic movement, which was militaristic. And so that's why they borrowed these histories. They kind of, they used some of the truth, and then they also added on the version of reality that they wanted, so that the eventual followers of the religion would be pacifistic and pay their taxes.
Okay, well, I happen to have caught your radio debate with Dr. Robert Price, and he seems to think that, well, yes, there are a lot of parallels in the Gospels to other extra biblical literature, but basically the New Testament is a compilation of myths which have evolved over a period of time, and you contend that this compilation was not a mere compilation, but a deliberate construct.
Right.
Can you go into detail about that, please?
Sure. I'll give a couple examples. You'd have to actually go through the book to come to a completely coherent understanding of this, because it's a very large literary system that we're dealing with. But the events in Jesus' ministry are related to Titus's campaign, and in fact are a kind of prophecy of it. And so that's another of the areas that you really have to understand. One of the reasons the Gospels is not unfortunately understood at this point is people don't understand the genre of literature that it is. And this is strange because it is essentially presented right at the beginning of the Gospels. Most people who read the Gospels, in fact, many Bible students or Bible scholars, are not familiar with what is called typology, even though it was a technique that was widely understood in the first couple centuries by Christian fathers. In Matthew, you have a real good example of typology, and I would ask everyone who wants to understand the Gospels to sort of spend some time with the birth narrative of Jesus to understand the typology that it represents. in the birth, narrative in Matthew, which begins the Gospels, you start out with Joseph going down to Egypt. And this, in fact, is linking to the story in the Old Testament regarding Moses, where in Genesis you have, the passage where Joseph goes down to Egypt. These aren't complete parallels, but there is information being exchanged between the two so that there is an unusual parallel. You have different contexts, different events going on, but there is these facts remain that in both these stories, Joseph goes down to Egypt. But then you start having some very specific parallels. You have a massacre of the innocents in both the Matthew story and in the story of Moses, and then you have a very specific sentence which states that they are dead who sought your life. And then this is followed by a return from Egypt to Israel, a baptism event, and then you have the tempting of God. And in the Gospels, you have Jesus in the wilderness, when you have the temptation of bread, and do not tempt the Lord thy God. And there's this very specific sequence of temptations. And in the story in Moses, you have the exact same events occurring conceptually. God is tempted by the Israelites in a very specific way. And so this is, I know this is kind of complicated material, but the point of it is really very simple. They're just showing that the life of Moses was foreseeing the life of Jesus, that the first Savior of Israel, his life foresaw the life of the second Savior of Israel, Jesus. Mm-hmm. And this is a typologic prophecy. The Dead Sea Scrolls has a number of examples in their peshers of the same genre. You have this, a type is created which then foresees what is going to occur in the future.
Can you explain to everybody what a pesher is?
It's just an interpretation of Scripture, so that the secret of the Scripture is revealed by someone who's doing an interpretation of it. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have probably the most famous is the Habakkuk pesher, where the author of the pesher is looking in the story of Habakkuk, and he's seeing parallels between what was written about Habakkuk and an individual that he refers to as the righteous teacher. Mm-hmm. He's seeing that there are these parallels showing the foreseeing of the life of the righteous teacher in the Scriptures. And this was the genre that the Gospels were created as a mockery of. So the very first thing you have to do if you want to understand the Gospels is you have to understand the kind of typology that the literature is a mockery of. And you can do that by either reading the sort of the Dead Sea Scrolls pastures, which are sort of complicated, but more simply it's just by going to Matthew and looking at the birth narrative and comparing it to the story that it is based upon in Genesis and Exodus. When you see that, when you see the relationship, you'll understand what a type is, that Moses is the type that foresees the life of Jesus. And my thesis shows and attempts to show that Jesus then was created as a type. What the character of Jesus really is not a historical character, but he is a literary construct that was created as a type of Titus Flavius, who was the real Son of God. Now, this may seem like a really far-fetched idea, but you have to remember that the Flavian Caesars claimed to be the Messiah. They claimed that the Jewish messianic prophecies foresaw them. This was actually written in both Josephus and Suetonius. They recorded the fact that the messianic prophecies foresaw these specific Caesars. So the notion that Jesus is foreseeing Titus, who is the real Messiah, is not at all far-fetched. It just requires that you actually recognize sort of these basic historical realities.
Weren't there other characters that Jesus was based on, or were there other Jesuses?
There were a whole series of Christs during this era, and you get into, the Gospels are complicated, and in my book I go on I show the most basic level of them as the fact that Jesus his ministry is a type of Titus Flavius, but in fact it also looks forward to another Messiah who is a Jewish one who appeared during the Jewish War, whose name is Eleazar. But at that point, you're into some very sophisticated typology, and it's in a show like this, it would be hard to get into it. I would just recommend, if people are curious about that, to read the book. But the really simple truth that people can see, as far as identifying Jesus and as a type of Titus Flavius, the most simple one is just to go to start with the beginning. And Jesus says at the Sea of Galilee that you will be fishers of men. And if you begin to read Titus's campaign in Josephus, you'll see that his first event is at the same location, and it's the same event. He fishes for men at the Sea of Galilee. And this then starts a long series of events that go through Jesus' ministry and are replicated in Titus's campaign. And once you see the conceptual relationship, which is of course hidden, it's not completely overt, you have to have a little bit of thinking, but once you see it, you'll recognize it's deliberate because it's occurring in the same sequence. In other words, the most transparent aspect of the Jesus-Moses typology, the thing that makes it so visible, is that the events that are linked are occurring in the same sequence. If you look at literary parallels, like that are circumstantial, for example, the famous ones between Lincoln and Kennedy,
right,
they don't occur in the same sequence. They simply can't, because if they are accidental, then they are subject to the rules of probability concerning random events, and they have to just occur at random. Mm-hmm. So when you have sequences of unusual events, this is highly unusual and strongly suggestive that you've got a deliberate pattern, not an accidental one. This is why DNA testing enables people to be put into prison, is because when you have unusual events, in that case it's 1 times out of 4, and if they occur over a long sequence, in the exact same order, you know that one sample is from the same person as the other sample was taken from. Well, that shows you that the Jesus-Moses typology is deliberate, and anyone who reads the book and sees how vivid the parallels are and how absolutely clear-cut they are will recognize that the relationship between Jesus and Titus is not accidental, and that it's a deliberate literary event.
Titus's military campaign, as told to us through War of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, is a mirror of the New Testament.
It's the basis of it. The Gospels, you have the 4, books in the Gospels, but there's actually a 5th book to the Gospels, and that's the Wars of the Jews, which is the history written by Flavius Josephus of Titus's campaign. And what's interesting is that book, though it's no longer recognized essentially as part of the canon, was attached to some of the very early versions of the Gospels.
Right.
They actually had the Josephus work with them, and the reason they did that is because the early Christian scholars recognized that all of Jesus' prophecies, his overt prophecies, are coming to pass in the war that Titus waged against the Jews. In other words, Jesus says, hey, I foresee Jerusalem encircled with a wall. Very specific event, encircling a city with a wall. Very unusual, it's not totally unusual, but it's reasonably unusual. And yet Titus accomplishes that. Jesus sees that the temple is raised. He says, I see not one stone atop another. Titus essentially, levels the temple. He predicts woe for very specific Galilean towns. Titus levels all of those towns. So the overt prophetic relationship between Jesus' ministry and Titus's campaign was understood from very early on, that hey, everything that Jesus is predicting, Titus is bringing about. And Jesus says that this is all going to come to pass. All of these events, this apocalyptic sequence of events that he envisions, is all going to come about during the time when the Son of Man makes a visitation. And he's using the expression the Son of Man in the context that Daniel uses it, which is as the Messiah. So you have, from the very early beginnings of Christian scholarship, you have an understanding that Jesus was predicting the events of Titus's campaign. And you also have, from the historians of the era, the clear-cut declaration that Titus saw himself as the Messiah. Mm. So it's that Titus was simply the only individual in history that could have been the Son of Man that Jesus was envisioning. It probably couldn't have been Jesus because he didn't show up to actually, at least to date, to work any of these events. But Titus did. Titus fulfilled all of the events that the Son of Man was supposed to have brought about during his visitation. And Titus flatly claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. So when you start out with that understanding, which unfortunately is not an understanding that is widely known even by Christian scholars at this point. But when you start out with these things which are completely clear-cut and which are demonstratable to anyone, then you look at the relationship, the conceptual relationship between Jesus' ministry and Titus' campaign, and it is completely crystal clear that the literature of the Gospels was created to envision the Titus's campaign and to proclaim him as the Jewish Messiah.
Okay, let's go further into the anti-Semitism in the New Testament. Was this so Titus can be successful in his campaign, or what
Right.
was this about?
The anti-Semitism, in my mind, was created out of very personal reasons, and it didn't have to be. In other words, it would have been possible to have developed a pacifistic version of Judaism that wasn't so specifically anti-Semitic as the Gospels are. In the Gospels, you have the famous passage where a mob is demanding that Pontius Pilate give them Jesus. Mm. And when he says, okay, I will do this, but I consider him just, and the mob of Jews cries out, well, his blood will be on our hands and on our children's hands. All right. Well, if it's fiction, why would you need to put that in there? And the reason, in my mind, is just out of the personal hatred that the Flavians felt for the Messianic movement. Historians record that both Vespasian, Titus's father, and Titus were wounded during the war. Mm. Titus evidently never regained full use of his left arm. He took a stone to it during some battle. And so it was in that context of a Caesar, who are among the most egomaniacal individuals, at least as far as we can tell, who've ever lived, having been wounded, having been physically wounded. And it was in that context that the Gospels were written. So that was that the hatred of the Jews that the Gospels reflect is a simple reflection of the fact that the people who were responsible for the work being created were so anti-Semitic. And
where's the proof that this was deliberate
right.
anti-Semitism?
Right. Well, the simplest proof, and it's one that anyone who is listening to this show can simply do themselves, is in fact Josephus in his history of the war, which links to the Gospels, created a passage which flatly declares the basis and the fact that anti-Semitism is an invention of the Romans. What you can do, what a viewer is able to do, is simply go online. You don't have to buy the book. To an online copy of Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, and go to the 6th book, line 201 through 219, and this would be either in the Whiston translation or in Perseus, which is a collection of online antiquity. Go to Book 6, line 201 through 219, and you will see that the first half of the passage is a description of a human Passover lamb. The Passover lamb is a son of Mary. The location is Jerusalem. And you can see that the authors have created the Passover lamb using the same techniques that were found in the Gospels. In other words, the child is flatly stated to be a sacrifice. He is from the house of hyssop, and he is roasted. Now, it takes a little bit of understanding of the Gospels to recognize the symbolism, but in the Gospels, they combine hyssop with one of the instructions for the preparation of the Passover lamb, which is that you don't break the bones of it. In the Gospel of John, the soldier marks Jesus with a rod of hyssop, and then you have the statement that they don't break his bones. So you know that the author has established him as a symbolic human Passover lamb, and this links back to Jesus' statement saying, if you don't eat of my flesh, there'll be no life in you. This very unusual cannibalism language, which is in the Gospels, and of course is not a reflection of anything in Judaism, but is in the Gospels for some particular reason. Well, if you then look at the passage in Josephus that I mentioned, you'll see that this son of Mary, who is a sacrifice, is from the house of hyssop, which is even a clearer metaphorical relationship to the actual Old Testament use of hyssop with the Passover lamb, and is stated that he is roasted, which was the other instruction regarding the preparation of the Passover lamb. So if you have any doubts, you can simply dial up a rabbi and ask him, what is the roasted sacrifice of the house of hyssop?
Sure. And
you'll see, or any Jew, someone who's familiar with their canon, they'll know, that is the Passover lamb. So this child in Josephus is a perfectly transparent parallel to Jesus. He is a human Passover lamb, and whereas Jesus states that you must eat the flesh in order of in a cannibalistic sense, this child is actually eaten by his mother. So you have here two really obvious passages that are related, because these are the only human Passover lambs, that I've ever encountered in literature. There's only so many concepts that you can use to set up a human Passover lamb, and so the idea that they would occur circumstantially is far-fetched, and they're both flatly stated to be the son of Mary, and the location is Jerusalem. Okay, so now you then move on in the passage in Josephus, and you'll see that the second half of the passage describes what the effect of this character is going to be upon the Jews. And you have one of the most brilliant pieces of wordplay in literature, and I wrote about this in one of my online discussions, and I said that you have to give the devil his due because it's very witty. In Josephus, the child is described as a myth for the world. This child is a myth for the world, and they use the Greek word mythos, whose eating and killing will be seen as an atrocity. And they use the Greek word misos, and then this atrocity will then create bitter hatred, mesos, of the Jews. So in other words, what this triple homophonic wordplay with this subtly, shifting, just a single letter being, taken out of each of the words as you move through the process. What it indicates is that the Son of Mary, who is a Passover lamb, is a myth, and a myth for the world, who's going to be seen as an atrocity, whose death and eating will be seen as an atrocity, and that this will create bitter hatred of the Jews. Now, to combine that description of what actually occurred in history, right, to combine that statement with the only other than the Gospel's creation of a literary human Passover lamb. You can argue that it's circumstantial, but this would just be so far-fetched that in my mind, it's really not even something you'd want to consider in a rational context. And I've written that it is not just a bad analytic technique of the contemporary gospel and Bible scholars that this passage isn't understood in this way. It is just a complete breakdown in human intelligence. I mean, this is so clear-cut that to not investigate it within the framework that I suggest is just crazy. And I would ask that any reader, who thinks that the thesis that I present is far-fetched, to simply take the 5 minutes it would take to dial Josephus up online, The Wars of the Jews, go to this passage, read it, and look at both the description of the human Passover lamb who's the son of Mary, and of the very sophisticated wordplay, which indicates that this is going to be, this myth for the world is going to create the bitter hatred of the Jews, and not, agree that this is that my interpretation is the correct way to understand this passage. The other thing that is important to recognize, and you'd have to read Caesar's Messiah to understand this, is that this event is also within a framework of events. This event is not simply just some sort of standalone event that just pops up in the middle of Wars of the Jews, but that this event is occurring in a pattern. Remember, I had originally talked about the fishing of men that begins Jesus' ministry and also Titus's campaign. Well, the episode of the son of Mary, who is a Passover lamb, that event is occurring between the crucifixion of, it leads up to the crucifixion of 3 individuals and 1 person brought down from the cross who survives. And in other words, this event is within a framework of concepts which are parallel in both the Wars of the Jews and the Gospels that occur in the same sequence.
Okay. Were there any other extra biblical references to this besides from Flavius Josephus that lead you to believe that this was meant as anti-Semitism?
I mean, some of the most famous are, of course, the speech by Eleazar at Masada, in which he takes a position that the destruction that the Jews experienced was brought about by God because of the fact that they were wicked. In other words, if you look at Jesus's perspective of Jews, he always talks of them in the context of a wicked generation, right? Now, a generation is 40 years, and this, of course, would encompass exactly the right time frame to overlap with the military campaign of Titus Flavius, from 30 through 70 and from 33 through 73. These are the exact, time spans that would show that the Gospels are linking to the war. But in Eleazar's speech, you have this repetition of the wickedness of the Jewish rebels, which of course is a very clear parallel to Jesus's perspective. Jesus is looking into the future and saying that they're going to be wicked. Eleazar is talking as a character from history, saying we were wicked. And
so in other words, Jesus's words were really Eleazar's words.
Well, they're all coming from the same perspective. In other words, the authors of the speech of Eleazar is also the author of the Gospels, or at least they are a unified literary group who understand the same things and are creating the literature to have one particular idea, that the wickedness of the Jews, which Jesus was constantly referring to, and he was saying you have to repent. Well, what did they have to repent from? What was the sin? Jesus foresees the wickedness that brings about the destruction of the Galilean towns, the encircling of Jerusalem with the wall, and the razing of the temple. He sees the wickedness that brings that up. That's the rebellion. The Jews that Josephus is then writing about are all agreeing with Jesus that we were wicked. So that, and then of course, this again is confirmed by the passage that I mentioned earlier, where Josephus just flatly states that, we are creating a myth that is designed to bring about the hatred of the Jews. The myth is, of course, the myth of Jesus, and it is confirmed, that myth is confirmed by the history. We shouldn't take either one of them seriously, neither the Gospels nor really Josephus's description of what goes on in Wars of the Jews. this is not a history we're dealing with. It's a literary operation to try to make people hate Jews, and of course, at one level, and also confine the real messianic movement on the other.
Okay. Well, this is all very interesting, and you know, I was wondering. I mean, why do people place such importance on the works of Flavius Josephus, and that Jews have gotten their history from the works of Flavius Josephus?
Sure.
And
Well, unfortunately, the real voice of the Messianic movement was destroyed. In Wars of the Jews, Josephus records that the law, or that is the written scripture of the militaristic Jews, was brought into the Flavian palace and locked up and kept there. And of course, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they'd never found any actual Jewish material. Even though this was a literate population, it appears to me that the Romans simply destroyed all of the literature. And then that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls were found buried, hidden in caves, because they were trying to preserve some of the scripture, and were able to do so. But the Gospels were put into an area, or were being in circulation in a form where they wouldn't have to compete against the actual messianic scriptures. That was being destroyed systematically by Rome, and the Gospels were then something that would replace it.
knowing that there's so much anti-Semitism in the New Testament, there are, I mean, the Jews and the Christians have been allied with each other for a long time now, and it's kind of a very unfriendly thing to do, to bring about these facts now and telling Christians that their religion is a military campaign and political propaganda. I mean, really, I mean, what would you have to say about that?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I can't pretend to have a good answer to it. I would suggest that the transition culturally, if my thesis becomes widely held, which I expect it will ultimately, will be very difficult. Because it's such a transition of our understanding of ourselves, of our history, as well as our religion, particularly since the formation of Israel. We'll be challenged, by this information. As the geopolitics currently line up, you have Islam essentially in opposition to a unified Christian and Israeli community in some ways. Not in every case, but in some ways. And so something like this information can be threatening, I think, particularly to people who see that alliance as important. But I would point out that if you look at, for example, The Passion, the movie by Mel Gibson, you'll see that the problem with The Passion was not that it was an anti-Semitic endeavor, but that it was a very accurate endeavor. In other words, the story it told is really the story that the Gospels tell. And that story is very powerful and has been really what was responsible for the anti-Semitism that has been a 2,000-year burden upon that people. So that even though there is a tactical situation currently, that makes this especially awkward, this information, I would just say if you look with the long view, you'll see that everyone would be better off with an understanding of the truth. And I would also, point out, because I'm asked this all the time, and let me just give an example. Two of the very first people that I ever discussed my book with, once it was made public and people started reading it, were Christians that had contacted me, and both were terminally ill. And they were reasonably, they were very much using their religion as part of what was helping them go through the process. And they had read my book, and both of them came to the conclusion that it was either correct or seemed like it was correct. And they contacted me, and we exchanged information. And, it was extremely painful to go through the process of what my book really means to someone who's a Christian who's experiencing this crisis of faith as they're looking at their life fading away. But both of them came to the position that I hope is the one that everyone does, which is that in every case we're simply better off knowing the truth under any circumstance. It's very rare, and I don't think that, certainly not in a situation like this, that we'd want to deceive ourselves. And the other reason that I think it's important for the information to come out is simply that it's valuable to Christians. Not all of them, of course, but there will be a group of Christians who are very interested in the origins of the religion. And for those individuals, I just felt that I really was required to bring out the information. I couldn't keep it to myself because, if I was a Christian, a practicing Christian, and I was not, though I had been raised a Christian, but at the time I had written the book, I was writing the book, I wasn't. But if I had been, I would have expected an individual who knew this to inform me.
Do you see any political implications to discovering your thesis?
It's one of these threads of the fabric of culture that once it begins to be pulled, it's not possible to calculate what will unravel as a result. There's never been really anything like it. It is the Caesar who produced the literature wanted to have this enormous, emotional, cultural disaster occur when the truth of Christianity would be discovered. In other words, the literature is a literary time bomb. And it's designed really to bring about legacy. It has all these other purposes. It was designed to pacify the Jews. It was designed to create anti-Semitism. But really, it's vanity. That's really what the literature is. It's just like the Arch of Titus, this enormous physical structure was created to promote the legacy of a particular individual. The Gospels are meant to operate in the same way. And the fact that it's going to be this, enormous reversal of our understanding of ourselves, that's what the individual wanted. They want that explosion because they want the legacy. They want people to recognize how clever Caesar was to create this confusion. And the Gospels are going to eventually unravel. And incidentally, it really does. Now that the information is out, some scholars contest my thesis, others are supporting it. If you go on any of the many websites that discuss it currently, you'll see that there are, people who like it and people who dislike it. But ultimately, I am certain that it will eventually be the common understanding of the Gospels. Once the information has been brought out, it really can't ever be put back in the bottle. And it's just a question of how long the process is going to take. As far as I'm concerned, it can take, 2,000 years. I have no particular desire to be, sort of an anvil for this information. But now that it's out, in little increments and drips and drabs, just in different small ways at first, the people will start to recognize that the Gospels really aren't religious literature. They are a mockery of a particular genre of Judaic literature, typologic prophecy, and they are a vanity piece. They're really written to show off Caesar's genius.
Well, evidently, you have not been the first person to discover the Roman origin of Christianity. There have been others before you, but it's never been presented in the same way that you've presented these things in Caesar's Messiah. Do you think that this information that other people have done this and they've been called quacks? Do you think you're going to be called a quack?
I already have been many times. There has been a lot of scholars have speculated that Rome produced Christianity just because it's so historically logical. In other words, if you look at the history and you see that there is a messianic movement that's militaristic, and then you see, well, in the midst of this 100-year struggle, there is this pacifistic version of Judaism with all these strange Hellenistic attributes that pops up at just the right time. It's just very suspicious on its face. And scholars have attacked it in that manner. The information that I present is something that is testable. It's a little difficult to test it, but like a high school history class, for example, could test that the parallel passages that I claim are deliberately linked will be detected by a random sampling of random readers. In other words, if you just give them people 20 different passages to read from and then insert the one that I say is linked and then ask them, well, which one is the one that is linked to the passage in the gospel, you'll see that the very large fraction of people will recognize that, well, this has to be the fishing for men episode in Titus's campaign. It's got to be, is the one that is linked. And this is very unusual. The idea that passages can be seen as parallel is not something that occurs, all the time. It's very unusual. So the fact that these passages are occurring in the same sequence and in the same location and are recognizable by random sampling, it's very strong evidence. It's really hard to get around, and it certainly sort of takes it outside of the area of context or of quackery because it's testable. And this is what the people who came before me, who recognized that it was very logical that Rome would have produced this religion. The fact that the Pope, is the pontiff, which is the name of the head of the Roman College of Religion. The fact that Rome was the headquarters of the religion. All of these things are very suggestive of a Roman, relationship to the origins of it. The very first saints who were not apostles were Flavians, were relatives of the Caesars. Flavia Domitilla. The very first catacomb. Even today, the inscription is actually still there. She gave this to the Christians as their catacomb. So you have this relationship between the Caesars and Christianity from the very beginning. But what I've done is I've actually shown stuff that is really testable. Very easy for history classes to go through, the process I suggest, and they can verify for themselves that the ministry of Jesus was deliberately linked to Titus's military campaign. And there's also just coherency. Just go to Josephus 6:201 through 219. That's book 6, line 201 through 219, and read it. And you'll see for yourself that it's a very straightforward declaration that Rome produced it. So as far as being called a quack, so be it. In my debate with Dr. Robert Price, who never got down into name calling. In fact, he kept calling me brilliant, but then he would say brilliant, which is just sort of a way of dealing with a thesis that is hard to control, but you don't like. He said that it was parallel mania. In other words, he just said that I was seeing metaphorical connections that didn't exist, and parallels can be weak in two ways. This is very important stuff to know when you try to understand the Gospels and the relationship to Wars of the Jews. Parallels can be weak in two ways. They can either have no context or they can have no coherency. In other words, they are simply so far apart in where they come from. One like a Walt Disney story with something you find written on a wall of a pyramid. This context suggests that there's no connection because they're so distant historically, and how could the people be accidentally linking them up? Or they're not coherent. They just one person in a million sees the metaphorical connection. Well, in the case of the parallels I show, the context is completely clear. Titus claimed that he was the Jewish Messiah. He flatly declared it. His official historian, actually wrote it out, just flatly states he is the Messiah. So the idea that the Gospels are regarding him as a Messiah is could not be a more coherent context. And then as far as coherency, I'll just give you an example. The The one that Dr. Price was focused on when he used the expression parallelomania was the fishing for men. And he took the position that the metaphorical relationship between Jesus' words was self-evident. In other words, that when Jesus says fishing for men, the only thing he can possibly be talking about is, is going out and converting them to the new religion, right? That's what he thinks the words are self-evidently meaning. Well, the fact is, my interpretation is the literal interpretation of the words. That what Jesus was actually referring to was literally fishing for men. You have to read the book to really understand how what that phrase means, but just the obvious way of interpreting the expression fishing for men is the way that I interpret it. The genius, part of the genius of the authors of the Gospels was that they were able to hide the truth in plain sight. In other words, when Jesus says fishing for men, he means it literally. And when he says you have to eat of my flesh, he's not talking, in the spiritual sense, but rather this is a literal expression which is referring to what events in the war in which there was cannibalism. I mean, it's a gruesome reality when you begin to actually see what the meaning of the Gospels is. But the people who wrote it had a very rough humor. I mean, they had a very, very rough humor. And one of the things that I suggest is I don't think my book really should be read by kids. I think it's just too rough. And I really don't recommend that people who are, Christians and the faith is something that, they experience in a positive way. I have no agenda as far as getting my book into these people's hands. I think if you're really interested in the origins of Christianity, if anti-Semitism is important to you, if you want to understand how anti-Semitism came about, or if you just are someone who really wants the truth and are uncertain of it, then I think the book has a tremendous amount to offer to you. But other than that, the humor is very rough, and you should handle the information carefully.
Well, I thank you very much for all this information.
Thank you.
This may be even more information than we may want to know, because, it's nice to think about, Christianity is wonderful, it's poetic, it's beautiful literature, it conjures up some very interesting spiritual things. But when we realize that it's, entirely meant to destroy Judaism and the Jews, then it's kind of frightening. And when I think about piecing together a lot of characters who have passed and putting them together to make another character, it's kind of like creating a Frankenstein.
In a way, and in my opinion, it was a monster that got loose. I think that it's unlikely the authors of the Gospels would have envisioned it having, as long-standing a run as the dominant religion of Western civilization. The problem is, of course, that Christianity became, part of the method by which the ruling class was able to maintain power. And so once the feudal system, was put in place, it was going to be very difficult to have Christianity budge. But, this is just the circumstance we find ourselves in. And all I can say is that it would be a tragic event if there were anti-Semitic episodes that could have been prevented with, the dissemination of this information. And it would also, to my mind, be tragic if there were individuals who would have lived their life differently, as far as, their religious perspective, if they had this information. I just, I really believe that we're, this is a fragile condition we find ourselves in, obviously, here on the planet. And we just need all the good information we can get, all the honest, real information we can get to think clearly. And I think we will think more clearly if we understand the truth about Christianity than we would have otherwise.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the fact that you've given me another interview, and I hope everybody will, do some research on this and don't just take anyone's word for it. Do some research on this and look into this yourself. And I thank everybody for tuning in to Rodeph Emet, Pursuer of Truth. And we are exploring the roots of anti-Semitism. I'm so glad that you've joined us. I am Bracha bat Yosef. And do come back again soon. Shalom.